And welcome back. Here we go, Chapter 10, Monitoring, and it should say Controlling Information Systems. So this is as critical as any conversation we've had. It's all about control and collecting data. So let's take a look at that. A couple of key terms. Monitoring is about the collection, maybe recording and reporting of that information. Maybe in executive summaries, for example. You never want to give all your data to leadership. They trust you. You're in a position. Give them an executive summary. Be ready to justify it if you need to. Controlling is about using that data to make changes or to implement or to manage or to adjust before a change is needed, perhaps. And of course, evaluating requires good judgment, especially in terms of quality and project performance. Now, in the planning cycle, we are planning for control. Every time we build a management plan, a scope management plan, schedule, cost management plan, quality management plan, communications management plan, resource management plan, risk management plan, procurement management plan, stakeholder management plan. They're all about how I'm going to do the various processes to make this project work. And first and foremost to me is how I'm going to control. The things we mainly control are the triple constraint: time, cost, and scope. But of course, there are other key areas I really want to measure and collect data on, measure, and control, and that's quality and risk at the top of the list. And it's kind of a closed loop system, right? I've done my planning, I'm doing my executing now. In my executing, I'm collecting data, I'm gathering it into an executive summary or some form of report, and then I'm going to make change recommendations to control it, right? And that may mean going back to planning even during the project for certain aspects. Okay. Now this is a project authorization and expenditure control system from the book. It's good. I would say review it just for to be familiar with it, but it's almost like operations as opposed to a project. But there's some good information there, so work through that. Now, when I design a monitoring system, I want to identify the factors that I have to control. And like I said, we should always start. Our primary scorecard as project managers is in the iron triangle, or the triple constraint: scope, cost, and schedule or time, right? And I want to collect information, but don't forget risk, quality, resources. Those are all key as well. If I had to list, say, 5 or 6 of the top. Now, what I want to do is be careful of what kind of data I'm collecting. Not every piece of data will lead to information. So there are 3 pieces to consider. There's data I collect, which is just data. It says nothing to me. But then I analyze it, and that's called information. Now I'm ready to make a decision, or at least recommend a decision. And then there are reports where I can summarize the data, the analysis, and the findings, and a recommendation, all in a 1-page report. Okay, so you want to think in terms of data, data, which is just raw, analysis, information, which is the analysis of that data, and reports, which is showing it to executives or decision makers along the way. And that way you can hopefully avoid collecting too much data. Now, how do you know if your project's in trouble? Well, here's some good examples. Is there confusion throughout, right? Muddy waters at various aspects. What about mysterious stakeholders? Because if a stakeholder pops up that you didn't realize before and they have a legitimate requirement, you are in trouble. And that's why you want to identify all stakeholders early on and collect requirements, right? A new requirement found out late will result in delays and increased costs because you have to go back at some point and start over, or at least to some aspect of it. Unconstrained constraints, right? If you don't manage risk, if you don't manage quality, etc., it's going to be a problem. Suspicious status reports. Who's putting them out? They ought to all run through your office. And of course, conflict management. Now, with data collection, it's what do we need to know and how are we going to collect it and then report it? That really is the bottom line question in data collection. Data is everywhere. Make sure it's something that's valuable to you, right? Forms of data. Frequency counts. If you've had a mathematics or a statistics course, you are familiar with frequency counts. How often something happens. You might keep a tally sheet, for example. What about just raw numbers? I'm just collecting data. It doesn't have to speak to me yet. Raw numbers work. And then, of course, numeric ratings, indicators, even verbal measures. Don't prefer that, but it's useful. And it's something, as long as I can quote it in the executive summary report. Now, everyone should be tied to this reporting system. Remember, 90% of what you do as a project manager is communication. So, you want to get this information out in an executive form to stakeholders. Collect their feedback. You don't want them surprised at a meeting, and at the same time, you want their input before it goes final, right? And so, reports should address their particular needs as you assessed when you did your stakeholder analysis along the way. And so not everybody needs the same depth of frequency and information. Do you remember back in, I think week 1, maybe week 2, but I think week 1, we talked about a stakeholder power and interest grid, right? Not everybody gets the same information. You're busy and you want to make sure that you manage it accordingly. As well as the frequency that would be tied also to that grid. And all of that information, your stakeholder analysis, your stakeholder grid, going into the communication plan that you built on how to manage the stakeholders. Now for reporting, so I collect the data, I analyze it, that's the information. Now I'm ready to make a report, right? Again, I have to identify by stakeholder how often they need it. Right? Not everybody gets the same report every time on the same schedule. It is a form of control, so I want to be able to use it for that. I want to make recommendations. Remember, I want to summarize my data in a single page. In that same page, I want to address my analysis in a short paragraph, and then I want to make a recommendation along the way in efforts and will recommend something to control as part of that recommendation, right? And so sometimes those reports are for senior management, sometimes they're for project managers, but usually for decision makers. Now, the report should be based on your project and corporate goals and should parallel the current activities that you're working on. You have to understand the relationships of the tasks that you're working on. So you would make sure you understand the network diagram because that demonstrates the relationships of the activities that support your scope as defined in your work breakdown structure. And by doing that, you're going to minimize confusion with the team, create visibility on the right issues for you, and of course, keep your customer up to date. So some reports are routine, like collecting budget data once a month. Some reports are by exception, like when you need a change control to be implemented ASAP and you need the board to consider it. And sometimes there's special analysis, maybe a new law passed or a new regulation that will impact your project, like privacy rights with CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That might require a special analysis. And then, of course, you'd hold meetings. You want to issue the reports before the meetings, let people study it, and bring copies to the meetings. Then talk about it, and only invite the right people to the meeting. You do not have to invite the same group to every meeting. We find that common. And at the same time, I recommend that you make sure you analyze who is your audience. So here are some meeting rules that you could use. Always have an agenda, publish it in advance. Set a time limit to the agenda for discussion. I say no new ideas unless they're an emergency. They should be discussed in advance first and get on the agenda. And then of course I close with taskers due by the next meeting, and I republish that after the meeting, which will look similar to the next agenda. Now, sometimes too much is too much, right? It obfuscates the information you're trying to share. So you want to be careful about how much detail you provide. Be ready to speak to it and defend it, but an executive summary should be executive level, right? And so you'll also want to make sure that you've got a good interface between the data and the information systems that you're collecting, and make sure you have good correspondence skills. Now, one of the reports that we'll do is earned value analysis, or EVA, right? And earned value analysis merges scope, schedule, cost into a reporting structure, a single reporting structure, using earned value. So earned value analysis uses earned value. That basically answers the question, how much work has actually been accomplished, right? And this EVA is going to help you through earned value management. It's going to help you monitor and control your project. So an earned value chart and the calculations, you work the baselines. The baseline is your standard, and on your EVM chart, that's going to create an S curve that we saw earlier, right? That's how a project runs. And so earned value describes how much work has been done over time on the horizontal axis, and versus how much was planned to get done, right? And it'll also compare your actual money spent, actual costs, versus how much you planned to spend along the way. Now, when I'm estimating how much work is done in earned value, some project managers go by the 50-50 rule. So usually a task lasts a week, 2 tops, and you say, well, okay, the minute they start, I'm going to give them 50% credit, and when they call in that it's done, I'll give them the other 50%. I think that's a good rule, because especially if it's a 1 week or 7-day reporting period, by the time they report in that you've started and you publish in some report, it's Wednesday, and they are actually halfway done. So I think that's good. Some project managers are pessimistic. They won't give you any credit until it's done. I don't really subscribe to that, but it's a thing out there. You could make your team leads or your deliverable leads, your activity leads, call in with a critical input. And then, of course, you could use some other proportionality rule. All of it creating this kind of S-curve chart that we talked about earlier. And notice this main curve right in the middle, that's your planned budget at completion. So here's the start of your project. Here's the end of your project, budget at completion. And this S-curve is the earned value and the cost you plan to be on. Now notice, at any point in time, you take a measurement. And that's why I said the cost baseline is time-based, right? So at a point in time, you say, okay, where am I at? Well, here's where we should be at on the S-curve. But my earned value, the work actually done, is below that. So that's bad, that's negative. And yet I've spent more money than I planned. That means that if I extrapolate my project out, it's not good. My estimate at completion is going to be much higher than my budget at completion. Now, to me, that's a negative view of the world because it says I can't control it. Sure, I can. If I know why my costs are here, I can bring it back in line. So I'm okay with that. And so let's take a short break, and we will come back and talk about this some more.